Bronze bull. The heated bronze bull was one of the most macabre torture inventions of antiquity. Created in ancient Greece, the device was a hollow sculpture of a bull made entirely of bronze. The victim was placed alive inside the metal structure, and a small door was locked immediately afterward. Then, a fire was lit beneath the bull, gradually heating the metal until it reached scorching temperatures. As the person's body was slowly burned from the inside out, their screams of pain echoed within the bull's hollow walls. But the most sinister detail lay in the engineering. The bull contained a system of tubes and chambers that transformed human screams into sounds resembling the bellowing of an ox, making it seem to the surrounding crowd like a grotesque melody. To the spectators, it appeared as though the bull itself were alive and in agony. The victim, however, was slowly roasted inside the bronze oven, inhaling hot air as their skin peeled away. Internal organs were destroyed by the extreme heat, and consciousness faded only when the body could no longer endure. It was a spectacle of horror designed to entertain and terrify at the same time. Rats in the stomach. The next cruel method is the torture with rats in the stomach. It was a practice especially used to force confessions or punish traitors in a terrifying way. The victim was immobilized, usually naked, and a metal bucket was fastened over their abdomen. Inside the bucket, 1 or 2 live rats were placed. Then the executioners heated the bucket with embers or direct fire. Desperate to escape the heat, the rats dug the only possible path, into the victim's body. With their sharp claws and teeth, the animals began tearing the skin, piercing the muscles, and making their way through the internal organs, causing indescribable pain. The sensation was of something alive devouring from within, with frantic movements and bites that tore through nerves and guts. The suffering could last minutes or hours, depending on the victim's endurance and the rat's speed. It was a grotesque and terrifying scene, often carried out in front of spectators as a way to intimidate anyone who dared to disobey. Death came accompanied by unimaginable agony, leaving the body completely destroyed from the inside. A cruel method, but effective in spreading fear and submission during dark times. Let's move on to the next method of punishment, but if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. It would be a pleasure to have you here with me. Scaphism. The punishment method known as scaphism or boat torture is considered one of the most cruel ever devised. Practiced in ancient Persia, it involved trapping the victim between 2 hollowed-out canoes or logs, leaving only the head, hands, and feet exposed. The executioners then forced the victim to ingest large amounts of milk and honey, which caused constant vomiting and diarrhea. Additionally, the body was smeared with more honey, especially on the exposed areas, to attract insects. The prisoner was then set adrift in a swamp or stagnant lake under the scorching sun. Over the following days, the accumulation of excrement inside the canoe mixed with heat created a fetid environment ideal for the proliferation of worms and larvae. Flies, ants, and other insects began to feed on the still-living body, laying eggs in open wounds and natural orifices. The victim, completely immobilized, rotted slowly from the inside out, entering a state of delirium caused by pain, fever, and infection. This ordeal could last days or even weeks, making it one of the most prolonged and horrifying executions in history. It was a slow, conscious, and absolutely inhuman death sentence. Disembowelment. Disembowelment was one of the most brutal and painful forms of execution in history. The condemned person was tied up while still alive, fully conscious and immobilized in front of a crowd or inside dungeons. Then the executioner would make a deep cut in the victim's abdomen, slowly exposing the intestines. The goal was not a quick death, but to prolong the suffering as much as possible. The intestines were pulled out inch by inch, often wound around cranks or wooden reels. Some reports describe the executioner heating iron bars to cauterize specific parts and keep the victim alive longer. During the process, the victim remained conscious for long minutes. They would scream, choke on their own blood, or go into shock, unable to react. The smell of blood and exposed entrails was unbearable. The audience sometimes applauded or watched in complete silence, paralyzed by the horror. And you know what paralyzes me with terror? The fact that you haven't liked this video yet. Do it now. It's free. In religious or political contexts, disembowelment was used as a warning to those who dared to challenge authority. It was a method designed not just to punish, but to traumatize. Every detail was planned to cause fear. The victim's body was often left on display after the execution, as a reminder of what could happen to the disobedient. Sawing in half. Sawing in half was one of the most brutal and slow punishments ever recorded in history. The victim was suspended upside down, usually with their legs spread and tied so that the blood would remain concentrated in the upper body, delaying unconsciousness. The executioners would then begin the cut with a sharp saw, starting at the groin. The inverted position allowed the person to stay alive and conscious for an extended period, while the tool slowly tore through muscles, bones, and organs. The goal wasn't just to kill, but to prolong the agony as much as possible, turning the execution into a spectacle of pain. The saw would move down inch by inch, often being replaced by an even sharper one when encountering resistance in the pelvic bones. Screams, dripping blood, and the sound of cracking bones were part of the scene. The crowd watched, horrified and fascinated. This method was used not only as punishment, but as a public lesson, a clear warning that certain crimes or behaviors would be punished with indescribable pain. The horror of this practice lay not only in the physical torment, but in the coldness with which it was carried out, as if human life were no more than wood to be cut. Impaling. The victim was laid on a table or wooden bench, with arms and legs tied to prevent any movement. The executioners then coated a long, sharp, and slightly rounded stake with animal fat, not out of compassion, but to ensure it penetrated more easily and prolonged the suffering. The stake was carefully inserted through the victim's rectum, often with slow, controlled pressure to avoid rapidly piercing vital organs. The goal was not a quick death, but an agony that could last for hours or even days. With the body slowly raised upright, gravity caused the stake to gradually penetrate deeper, passing through muscles, intestines, and internal cavities. The pain was indescribable. In many accounts, the victim remained conscious through much of the ordeal, screaming, convulsing, and writhing in despair. In public executions, this type of impalement served as an extreme warning to the population. The impaled body was left exposed for days, rotting before everyone's eyes, as a reminder of what happened to those who defied authority. It was a method of torture designed to physically destroy and psychologically annihilate. Crank torture. The crank torture, also known as joint torment or limb breaking, was a brutal method used to slowly shatter the joints and bones of the victims. The person was laid or seated on a wooden structure, with hands and feet firmly tied with thick, sturdy ropes. These ropes were connected to iron cranks that, when turned gradually, pulled the limbs in opposite directions. With each turn of the crank, the ligaments were stretched beyond human limits, causing excruciating pain. In a short time, the joints of the shoulders, elbows, knees, and ankles were dislocated with sickening cracks. But the executioners did not always stop there. They continued turning, tearing tendons, fracturing bones, completely dislocating limbs until the victim's body became unrecognizable, like a broken puppet. This type of torture was used not only to punish, but also to extract confessions. Many passed out from the pain before the cranks reached their limit. Others were kept conscious with splashes of cold water or searing jabs from hot iron rods. It was a raw display of power intended to terrify all who witnessed the ritual. Rat dungeon. The rat dungeon was a particularly cruel and distressing form of punishment. The victim was taken to a subterranean cell located in the lowest parts of a castle, usually in damp and flooded areas near the foundations of the walls or close to channels connected to rivers. These cells, sometimes referred to as flooded dungeons, were built in a way that the water level would rise and fall with the tide or river flow. When the tide was low, rats and other rodents would emerge from their burrows in search of food. What they found was a defenseless human body, chained, starving, and covered in wounds. The rats would not hesitate to attack. They started with the fingers, the face, the most exposed parts. They gnawed at the skin, penetrated small openings, and burrowed with sharp teeth. The torment was long, painful, and mentally devastating as the victim did not die instantly. Death came slowly, through infection, hemorrhage, and sheer terror. And if the victim tried to scream, it was in vain. Down there, no one could hear. The sound of rats chewing through flesh blended with the dark water seeping through the cracks of the cell. It was a silent, filthy torture, invisible to outsiders, but absolutely horrifying to those left inside. One of the most terrifying punishments of antiquity was known as poena culae, primarily used in ancient Rome to punish parricides, those who killed their own parents. The execution began with the victim being beaten or whipped in public as a form of humiliation and warning. Then, the person was sewn alive into a large leather sack along with 4 animals, a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. These animals were not chosen at random, but for their symbolic meanings: betrayal, savagery, poison, and madness. With all of them alive and panicked inside the tight sack, chaos erupted immediately. The animals, trying to escape, would attack each other and, in their frenzy, would bite, scratch, and sting the human trapped among them. The environment became a storm of noise, screams, and violence, a true madness confined. Finally, the sack was completely sewn shut and thrown into the sea or a deep river. There was no escape. Even if the victims survived the internal assaults, they would drown shortly after. It was a punishment designed to provoke fear, shame, and maximum suffering. The combination of symbolism, brutality, and psychological torment made it one of the most bizarre and disturbing sentences in history. Hanging cage. The hanging cage was a punishment that combined psychological torture with a slow and humiliating death. The condemned was placed in a small iron cage, often tight enough to prevent movement or even standing. This cage was then suspended in public places such as castle gates or town squares, where everyone could see. There, the person was left to die slowly, exposed to rain, scorching sun, freezing cold, and extreme hunger. There was no shelter, no water, and over time, pain turned into delirium. As the days passed, the body weakened, and urine and feces accumulated beneath the prisoner. Open wounds attracted insects, crows, and rats. In many cases, these cages were positioned near the sea or above rivers, where the rising tide would reach the victim's feet, making the wait for death even more agonizing. Bodies could remain there for weeks after death, rotting in plain sight as a grotesque warning. The intention was not just to punish, but to turn suffering into a spectacle, deterring anyone from defying the established order.
Death Dungeon.
In many castles and fortresses of the Middle Ages, there was a place hidden deep underground where light never reached: the Death Dungeon. There, condemned prisoners were thrown without trial, without record, and without hope. There were no organized cells or makeshift beds. Just a damp, dark, cold hole infested with rats, cockroaches, and mold. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, and the smell of decay permeated everything. The condemned was thrown in with rags on their body, often wounded, and left to their fate. There were no visits, no regular food. Sometimes, rotting food scraps were thrown in just to prolong the suffering. The water, when it arrived, was dirty, dripping down the walls like a constant leak. Over time, hunger became unbearable, driving the prisoner to complete exhaustion. The constant darkness affected their sanity. Many went mad, laughing, screaming, or simply giving in to absolute silence. The body weakened, covered in wounds and filth, until life simply faded away. When the hatch was finally opened, months later, what remained was an unrecognizable body, consumed by solitude, time, and rats. A slow, silent, and forgotten death. An end designed to erase any trace of existence. And so we end our journey through these punishments, so cruel they make you shudder just thinking about them. I truly hope you enjoyed the video. Take care, my friend. Subscribe to the channel and keep watching more curiosities like this one.